In Episode 3, titled Tool Purpose Map, No Commands, we're going to focus on a simple shift that makes Pen Test Plus questions feel far less random, thinking in terms of tool purpose instead of tool names. Learners often get stuck because a question drops a familiar tool name and they reflexively associate it with a single favorite use, even when the scenario calls for something else. On the exam, tool names are usually cues for outcomes, not invitations to show off memorized features, and the best answers tend to align with what the tool is meant to accomplish at that moment. When you train yourself to map tools to purpose, you start to recognize the job of an option quickly, even if you have never personally used that exact tool. The goal here is to build a mental catalog that stays at the level of outcomes, so you can reason through questions without relying on command recall or muscle memory. A practical way to build that catalog is to group tools by the outcome they produce rather than the interface they use or the niche they live in. If you can describe a tool's result in plain language, you can decide whether that result fits the question's objective and constraints. One clean grouping is discover, validate, and report, because those outcomes show up repeatedly across phases of an engagement. Discovery tools help you learn what exists and what might matter, but they do not prove anything yet. Validation tools help you confirm that a suspected condition is real, meaningful, and reproducible without unnecessary risk. Reporting tools and workflows help you capture evidence, translate it, and communicate it in a way that supports decisions and remediation, which is a core exam expectation even when the prompt is technical. Passive information tools fit naturally into the discovery category, and their defining characteristic is that they collect footprints rather than directly interact with the target in a high-touch way. Think of these tools as the ones that help you learn from what is already visible, already published, or already observable without knocking loudly on the door. In exam prompts, passive approaches are often favored when safety, stealth, or scope sensitivity is emphasized because they reduce the chance of disruption and reduce the chance of alerting defenses. The purpose is to gather context that makes later actions smarter, not to win anything on the spot. When you see passive information collection described, the correct answers usually reflect patience and signal gathering because you are building a base of facts before you make claims. If an option implies direct, noisy interaction while the prompt calls for minimal exposure, that mismatch is often the test. Network discovery tools are still about discovery, but they shift from learn from what exists to learn what is reachable, and that difference matters on the timeline. Their purpose is to check reachability and basic presence so you can decide what to probe next, and they often serve as a bridge between broad reconnaissance and more targeted enumeration. On Pen Test Plus style questions, reachability checking becomes important when you need to narrow attention to what is actually responding, what appears alive, and what might be filtered or segmented. The key is that network discovery does not automatically produce deep detail, and it does not automatically imply permission to proceed into heavier actions. It simply gives you a map of where responses exist and where they do not, which then informs your next decision under the constraints. If the prompt is early phase and the question is what next, an answer that checks reachability is often more appropriate than an answer that assumes you already know the service landscape. Enumeration tools move you from reachable to understood because they are designed to extract details about services, users, and shares in a way that supports informed decisions. In questions, enumeration often appears as identifying what is actually running behind an exposed interface, what accounts or roles exist, or what resources are accessible within the allowed scope. The purpose is not mere curiosity. It is to turn hints into actionable specifics that guide vulnerability discovery and later validation. Enumeration also helps reduce guessing, because a lot of wrong answers on the exam rely on assuming details that were never established in the prompt. When you select an enumeration-oriented option, you are often choosing to replace assumptions with evidence, which is exactly the mindset the exam rewards. The best enumeration choices respect safety and scope while still extracting high-value detail that clarifies the environment.
Vulnerability tools are best thought of as hypothesis generators because they suggest what might be wrong based on observed conditions, but they still require confirmation.
The exam regularly tests this distinction because learners sometimes treat a tool output as definitive truth rather than a candidate finding.
The purpose here is to efficiently surface potential weaknesses, patterns, or misconfigurations that deserve attention, and then to prioritize what to validate based on objectives and constraints.
A tool can indicate likelihood, but it cannot automatically prove impact in the way the exam expects you to demonstrate through controlled validation steps.
That is why many best next step questions follow a pattern where you identify a potential issue and then choose an option that confirms it safely rather than declaring victory.
When an answer choice treats a generated finding as final without validation, it often reflects the wrong level of certainty for a professional workflow.
Web proxy tools occupy a unique role because their purpose is less about finding a target and more about inspecting how a target behaves when you interact with it. They are request inspectors that help you see what is being sent, what is being returned, and how the application changes its behavior in response to inputs, state, and context. In exam scenarios, this purpose shows up when the prompt involves web application behavior, sessions, redirects, parameter handling, or inconsistent responses that need to be understood rather than brute-forced. The tool's value is visibility, because visibility turns a confusing black box into a system you can reason about. When you map this category correctly, you stop thinking web proxy equals hacking and start thinking web proxy equals observation and manipulation of requests to reveal patterns. That shift helps you pick answers that align with safe, controlled exploration instead of jumping straight to assumptions about vulnerabilities. Credential tools are easy to misunderstand, so a good purpose map frames them as probability engines that operate under constraints like lockouts, monitoring, and organizational policy. Their job is to test whether likely credentials, weak authentication practices, or exposed secrets can yield access, but their use is never isolated from safety and permission considerations. On exam questions, credential-related options are often traps when the prompt has not established authorization, when lockouts are likely, or when stealth and non-disruption are emphasized. The right choice is frequently the one that acknowledges those operational constraints, either by selecting a safer approach or by choosing a method that reduces risk of account disruption. Credential testing is also not a substitute for understanding the environment, because probabilities are only useful when they are tied to evidence and objective. When a scenario suggests tight monitoring or strict safety, selecting a credential probability option without regard to consequences is often exactly what the exam wants you to avoid. Identity graph tools can be described as relationship builders because their purpose is to model how identities, permissions, and resources connect into pathways. This category matters because many environments are effectively governed by who can access what, and subtle relationships often define the realistic route to an objective. In exam prompts, identity relationships might appear as role differences, delegated access, group membership hints, or trust boundaries that suggest a path without explicitly drawing it for you. The tool purpose way to think about this is that you are not running an identity tool, you are clarifying the relationship map so you can reason about plausible access moves. That mindset aligns well with questions asking for best next step when you suspect privilege paths exist, but you need to understand them before acting. When you choose a relationship-building option, you are choosing to reduce uncertainty about who can reach what and under what conditions. Exploitation frameworks should be mapped as controlled delivery systems that require strict safeguards, because their purpose is to prove impact in a disciplined way, not to serve as the default hammer for every nail. On Pen Test Plus questions, exploitation is often present as an option that sounds decisive and exciting, and that makes it a common trap when the scenario is actually earlier in the timeline or constrained by safety. A controlled delivery system mindset helps you select exploitation only when the prompt supports it, when you have authorization, when you have validated enough to justify it, and when the objective requires proof rather than speculation. It also emphasizes that professional exploitation includes guardrails, such as limiting scope of impact and avoiding unnecessary harm, even when you are proving a point. If an answer choice treats exploitation as casual or automatic, it often signals that it does not respect the safeguards implied by a professional workflow. Packet tools belong on your map as truth checkers for traffic, timing, and failures, because their purpose is to show what is actually happening on the wire when assumptions collide with reality. When a prompt describes inconsistent connectivity, unexpected failures, strange timing, or ambiguous behavior between systems, packet-level visibility often becomes the cleanest way to separate "it should" from "it did." On the exam, this category is valuable because it represents disciplined troubleshooting and evidence gathering rather than guesswork, especially when other indicators could be misleading. Packet truth checking can support discovery, enumeration, validation, and even post-access verification because it answers questions about what was sent, what was acknowledged, and where things went wrong. The key is to see it as a verification lens, not merely a technical flex, because the exam rewards the ability to confirm reality with evidence. When you select a packet tool purpose option, you are often choosing clarity and defensible proof over speculation. To make this usable under exam pressure, practice a simple habit. Name a tool and state its job in one sentence, focusing on outcomes rather than features. If you can say, "This tool's job is to discover reachable targets," or "This tool's job is to validate whether a suspected weakness is real," you have already done most of the reasoning the exam expects. The sentence should be short, concrete, and tied to the workflow timeline, because purpose without timing still leads to wrong choices. This habit also helps when you encounter a tool name you do not know, because you can infer likely purpose from how the prompt frames it and what outcome the option seems to produce. In many questions, you are not being tested on the name. You are being tested on selecting the right outcome for the situation. When your one-sentence job statement fits the objective and respects constraints, you are usually aligned with the correct answer. A memory trick that reinforces the whole map is to give each tool category one strong verb, because verbs keep you focused on what changes in the environment after the tool is used. For passive information tools, the verb is observe, because you are collecting what is already visible with minimal touch. For network discovery, reach, because you are confirming what responds and where pathways exist. For enumeration, detail, because you are extracting specifics that reduce guessing and sharpen decisions. For vulnerability tools, suggest, because they generate hypotheses that still require confirmation. For web proxies, inspect, because you are watching requests and responses to reveal behavior patterns. For credential tools, test, because you are applying probability within strict constraints and consequences. For identity graphs, map, because you are building relationship understanding for access pathways. For exploitation frameworks, prove, because the goal is controlled demonstration of impact. For packet tools, verify, because you are checking truth in traffic, timing, and failures. In this episode, the central idea is that tool names become meaningful cues when you can instantly translate them into purpose categories. Discover, validate, and report, supported by the specific jobs that sit under those outcomes. Passive information collection and reachability checks help you discover without overcommitting, while enumeration extracts the details that make later decisions defensible. Vulnerability tooling suggests what might matter, but validation thinking keeps you from treating suggestions as facts, and exploitation stays framed as controlled proof rather than impulse. Web proxies and packet-level visibility serve as inspection and verification lenses that turn confusion into evidence, while credential and identity-focused tooling remain constrained by operational reality and objective alignment. To apply the method today, pick 5 tool names you commonly see in practice questions and label each one by purpose in a single sentence, because that repetition is how the map becomes automatic. When the map is automatic, the exam feels less like memorization and more like professional reasoning under time pressure. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.